Something shifted in the atmosphere this week that nobody in the mainstream weather conversation has properly explained yet. Not the temperature numbers themselves. Those are being reported widely enough. Not the county lists or the forecast maps or the reassuring phrases about warm spells and settled conditions. What has not been explained is the specific thing that makes this particular forecast different from every other warm weather story Britain has seen this year. And it comes down to a single phrase that appeared in meteorological briefings in the second week of May 2026 and has been quietly reverberating through forecasting circles ever since. The date of the UK's first 30 degrees Celsius crossing of the year, a threshold that, in the long-range outlooks published at the start of May, was being discussed in the context of late June or early July, has been brought forward. Not nudged forward by a few days as models sharpen their near-term resolution, brought forward by weeks, by a margin that represents a fundamental change in what kind of year 2026 is shaping up to be and what kind of country Britain is becoming in its relationship with extreme heat. The number that British summers used to build toward over months of gradual warming is now sitting on the forecast map for May 28th. And if you think the only story here is whether to pack sun cream for the bank holiday weekend, you're missing something much larger and much more consequential. To understand why the date being brought forward matters so much, you first need to understand what the original expectation was and why it was reasonable. At the start of May 2026, the forecasting consensus was pointing toward a warm but not immediately exceptional spring, with the first 30-degree crossing of the year most likely arriving in the June to July window that represents Britain's historical peak temperature season. The Met Office's 3-month outlook for May through July 2026 assigned a 40% probability to a hot outcome, double the normal baseline probability, and flagged an increased likelihood of multiple heatwave events through the summer. But the language was calibrated for summer, not for late spring. Jim Dale, senior meteorologist at British Weather Services, had been among the most specific of the independent forecasters, suggesting that temperatures climbing well into the 30s should be expected in the latter stage of May and into June and July. Even that relatively aggressive early season outlook was placing the expectation of 30-degree temperatures toward the very end of May at the earliest, with June and July as the more probable delivery window. The atmosphere had other plans. And when the GFS model runs from mid-May began resolving the atmospheric pattern for the final week of the month, with increasing clarity and cross-run consistency, what emerged was a forecast that moved the goalposts in a way that even the most bullish of the independent outlooks had not fully anticipated. The mechanism behind the acceleration deserves to be understood on its own terms, because it reveals something important about how warm weather arrives in Britain and why the timing of this particular event is so compressed. Jim Dale's framing was direct. While the UK was shivering through a cold snap in the first half of May, the coldest May night in 5 years was recorded in that window. Central and Eastern Europe were sitting under scorching temperatures that had been accumulating since early spring. Central Europe had experienced intense heat. Eastern Europe was experiencing it. Spain had seen it even earlier in the year. The heat was not absent from the European landmass. It was simply waiting on the other side of the circulation pattern that was keeping Atlantic coolness locked over the British Isles. When a blocking high-pressure system began developing over southern Britain in mid-May, and the southerly atmospheric flow that normally feeds continental warmth northward into Europe began directing that warmth toward England instead, the accumulated heat of a continent-wide spring warm-up was essentially redirected and delivered to the UK in a compressed time frame. The gradual warming that would normally occur over weeks as a British spring transitions to summer happened in days. The date moved because the atmosphere moved, and it moved faster and further than the medium-range models had resolved with confidence, even 10 days before the event began appearing on the charts. Exacta Weathers, James Madden identified the cross-model agreement on the developing high-pressure system as the defining signal that elevated this beyond a single warm weekend. When the GFS, the ECMWF, and the independent modeling systems that professional forecasters track alongside the major operational models all converge on the same atmospheric configuration. The same blocking pattern, the same southerly flow trajectory, the same peak temperature range for the same dates. The confidence in a medium-range forecast moves from probabilistic to directional. Madden described conditions as perfectly primed for the developing warm period, noting that the cross-model agreement on the high-pressure rise was becoming impossible to dismiss. That kind of consensus in the modeling community is what separates a genuine forecast signal from the noise that weather models routinely produce at extended ranges, and the fact that it emerged for a late May 30-degree event, rather than the more familiar July or August scenario, is what made the brought forward framing not just journalistically convenient, but meteorologically accurate. The specific geography of where the 30-degree reading is being projected on May 28th reflects the well-understood dynamics of how London's urban footprint interacts with warm southwesterly airflows. The GFS places the peak reading just west of Greater London, covering the zone that takes in West London, Eastern Berkshire, and the inner commuter belt. Reading, Slough, Windsor, and Wokingham sit within the highest temperature bracket in the modeling output. Central London itself tracks at 28 to 29 degrees on the peak day. The wider southeast, Kent, Surrey, Sussex, Essex, Hertfordshire, Oxfordshire, Cambridgeshire, sits in the 27 to 29 degree band throughout the sequence. And the 27-degree threshold, which represents its own form of historical rarity for a late May reading in England, extends as far north as Yorkshire on the peak day. The reason the warmest point sits west of central London rather than within it is a function of how the urban heat island amplifies the incoming warm air. The dense urban core of London generates its own heat through the friction, energy use, and dark surface absorption of one of the world's largest metropolitan areas. When that existing urban warmth combines with warm southwesterly airflow, the highest temperatures concentrate in the zone where the airflow makes first sustained contact with the dense urban surface, which is the western and southwestern edge of the metropolitan area rather than the center. The 5-day sequence that delivers Britain to the 30-degree moment is worth understanding in full because the peak reading does not arrive in isolation. It is the product of accumulated heat load building across consecutive days, and that accumulation is itself part of what makes the health and infrastructure impact of the event greater than a single hot afternoon would produce. The sequence opens on May 24th with 27-degree highs in southeastern England and 25-degree readings in Yorkshire, already running 8 to 9 degrees above the seasonal average for that date across the southeast. May 25 holds the 27-degree ceiling across the southeast, with London at the top of the range, and East Anglia reaching 25 degrees by early evening. May 26 and 27 show a slight moderation to 25 and 26 degrees in the southeast and 20 to 22 degrees across the wider Midlands and northern England before May 28th arrives, and the temperature builds back through 28 and 29 degrees toward the 30-degree projection just west of London. That 5-day shape, opening warm, sustaining warmth through a brief mid-sequence moderation, then peaking on the final day, is the specific pattern that maximizes cumulative heat exposure for populations, that prevents overnight recovery from daytime heat stress on the nights where temperatures remain elevated, and that pushes infrastructure assets through repeated daily thermal cycling that accumulates mechanical stress even as each individual day's temperatures stay below the threshold that would trigger an emergency response on its own. The historical context for a late May 30th degree reading transforms this forecast from an interesting weather event into something with genuine climate record implications. The highest temperature ever officially recorded in the United Kingdom during the month of May is 29.4 degrees Celsius, set at East Finchley in London in 1944 during a prolonged warm, dry spell during the war years. That record has stood for more than 80 years. More recently, 25.1 degrees Celsius was recorded at Northolt in 2017, and 2018 saw 27.5 degrees Celsius in East Anglia during a warm May period. The 2026 forecast for May 28th at 30 degrees sits more than half a degree above the 82-year-old national May record. If the GFS projection verifies in observations, if the blocking high holds, the southerly flow delivers, and the urban heat island of West London amplifies the reading into the 30-degree range, then May 28th, 2026 becomes not just the first 30-degree day of the year, but a moment where the UK's climate record for an entire calendar month is broken by a margin that has not been approached since the original record was set in wartime conditions more than 8 decades ago. This is the scale of what the models are projecting. The health consequences of the date being brought forward are substantially more serious than they would be for the same temperatures arriving in their expected July window. And this is the dimension of the story that most weather coverage handles most inadequately. The human body acclimatizes to heat through a physiological process that takes between 7 and 14 days of sustained warm exposure to complete. During acclimatization, the cardiovascular system adjusts its operating parameters, sweat gland output increases and becomes more efficient, the kidneys shift their fluid retention balance, and the hormonal systems that regulate blood pressure and fluid electrolyte concentration recalibrate for the new thermal environment. When 30-degree temperatures arrive after a cold snap, after a period in which the body was actively conserving heat rather than managing excess of it, the acclimatization process has not started, not one day of it. The body being asked to manage a 30-degree thermal load on May 28, 2026 is physiologically in approximately the same adaptive state as a body in late winter. The British Heart Foundation's warning that a heat wave can increase heart attack mortality risk by up to 50% is based on heat events arriving into a population that has at least had some seasonal warming to adjust to. An event arriving cold into a fully unacclimatized population, with a peak temperature exceeding anything Britain has ever recorded in May, carries a risk profile that should be driving urgent public health communication rather than weather app updates. The cardiovascular mechanism deserves detailed explanation because it is the chain of events that kills people during heat events, and it operates through a sequence that is specific, well understood, and directly relevant to every person in the areas under the 30-degree projection. When the body is exposed to sustained high temperatures, the cardiovascular system is recruited as the primary cooling mechanism. Blood vessels in the skin dilate, vasodilation, to bring warm blood close to the surface where heat can radiate outward into the air. The heart must pump faster and harder to move blood at the volume required to sustain the surface cooling continuously. Simultaneously, sweating reduces total blood volume and increases blood viscosity, making the blood thicker and harder for the already overworked heart to push through narrowing peripheral vessels. In a healthy adult with a strong cardiovascular reserve, this system can sustain the effort for hours without catastrophic failure. In the millions of adults in the UK living with hypertension, coronary artery disease, atrial fibrillation, heart failure, type 2 diabetes, or chronic kidney disease, all of which are far more prevalent in the over 60 population that represents a major demographic in the 20 counties under the warm spell. The additional cardiac demand imposed by sustained 30-degree exposure can tip a compensated condition into an acute event with very little warning time. The ONS data from 2022 showing over 4,500 excess deaths in England during that year's heat periods was not produced by an exceptional failure of the health system. It was produced by the normal operation of this mechanism applied across a large population of vulnerable individuals who had no adequate way to escape the heat in buildings that were not designed to let them. The Public Health Alert Framework managed by the UKHSA operates on a seasonal calendar that has a core alerting window running from June 1st to September 30 each year. Outside that window, if a significant heat episode develops, the agency issues what it classifies as an extraordinary heat health alert, a designation that carries the same operational weight as an in-season alert, but arrives at a moment when the health and social care sector has not yet completed its summer heat preparedness activation. Care homes have not necessarily finished their seasonal heat management reviews. NHS trusts have not fully shifted their operational readiness posture toward heat. Community health teams have not yet identified and begun proactive outreach to the full list of high-risk patients in their areas. An extraordinary alert issued in the final week of May for a 30-degree event that the system was not configured to expect, until June falls into a gap between the winter-spring operational mode and the summer heat mode that exists in every health organization in England. The speed with which organizations can bridge that gap in the days between the forecast crystallizing and the peak temperature arriving determines how well prepared the frontline response is when the heat lands. Yellow alert status triggers enhanced monitoring and outreach for identified high-risk individuals. Amber alert triggers NHS-wide coordination, increased ambulance readiness, and the opening of cooling centers. The 5-day sequence building toward a May 28 30-degree peak is precisely the kind of event that moves through the alert levels rapidly, and the organizations serving the affected counties are managing that escalation against a preparation timeline that is shorter than any June or July event would provide. The infrastructure dimension of the date being brought forward is equally significant because the systems that manage rail, road, water, and power infrastructure were all configured for spring rather than summer operational parameters when this event began developing on the models. Network Rail's heat management protocols, the monitoring regimes, the speed restriction thresholds, the deployment of thermal imaging teams along the most vulnerable track sections are designed to be escalated in response to Met Office weather warnings rather than preemptively. When a 30-degree event arrives in late May rather than late June, the period between a confirmed high-confidence forecast and the peak temperature day is shorter than the system was designed to respond to. Parliamentary evidence from Network Rail confirmed that rail surface temperatures in direct sunlight can run more than 20 degrees above ambient air temperature, meaning that a 30-degree air temperature day produces rail surface temperatures of 50 degrees or above on fully sun-exposed sections. At those surface temperatures, the compressive forces building in continuously welded steel track approach and exceed the buckling threshold on older sections of track that have not been upgraded to modern concrete sleeper construction. The 2003 European Heatwave produced 137 rail buckles across the UK network in a single event at a cost of $2.5 million in delays and emergency repairs. Parliamentary projections suggest buckling events will be 4 to 5 times more frequent by the 2050s, a projection that was made before the pace of spring temperature escalation became as clear as it now is. The water resource picture adds another layer of urgency to the timing story that is specific to 2026 and specific to the date being brought forward into late May rather than arriving in June. England entered the final week of May carrying one of its most severe spring soil moisture deficits in nearly 7 decades. Groundwater levels, reservoir storage, and river flows were all running, below seasonal norms across the southern and Midlands counties sitting under the warmest part of the forecast. The Environment Agency and the major water companies serving those areas, Thames Water, Anglian Water, Southern Water, were already monitoring the situation before the warm spell forecast crystallized. When a 30-degree peak arrives in late May on top of that pre-existing drought deficit, the evapotranspiration rate, the combined moisture loss from soil evaporation and plant transpiration, accelerates dramatically. In agricultural terms, this means the East Anglian cropping counties of Norfolk, Cambridgeshire, and Lincolnshire, which appear on the elevated temperature county list, face a compounding of a dry spring moisture deficit with a peak heat demand spike that irrigation infrastructure was not sized to fully offset. Hosepipe ban discussions, which normally begin appearing in public utility communications in July or August of a dry year, were already being conducted at board level in May 2026 because the seasonal trajectory of the soil moisture deficit, combined with the prospect of a late May 30-degree peak, created a water resource risk timeline that had been brought forward on exactly the same basis as the temperature forecast itself. The sleep science dimension of this event rarely appears in mainstream weather coverage, but directly affects every person living in the warm zone across every night of the 5-day sequence. The ideal ambient temperature for restorative human sleep sits between 16 and 18 degrees Celsius. A tropical night. The specific meteorological classification for a night where the minimum temperature does not fall below 20 degrees impairs the body's ability to enter and sustain deep sleep cycles by maintaining the core body temperature too high for the physiological cooling that deep sleep requires. London experienced its all-time highest overnight minimum temperature record of 25.8 degrees Celsius at Kenley Airfield on the night preceding the 2022 peak. Temperature day. If the 2026 May 28th peak approaches or reaches 30 degrees in West London, the overnight minimum temperatures on the nights of May 27th and May 28th across the urban core and intercommuter belt will likely remain above 20 degrees, meaning that tropical night conditions, which were once rare enough to be noteworthy, will be occurring in May rather than July. The cumulative sleep deprivation produced across a 5-day warm sequence with tropical night conditions on the peak days has measurable effects on cognitive function, decision-making ability, cardiovascular health, immune function, and mental health outcomes that compound the direct health risks of the heat exposure itself. The pollen interaction with the warm spell adds a layer of impact that affects roughly 1 in 5 people in the UK and is almost never mentioned in temperature-focused weather coverage. The stable, warm, sunny, low-wind conditions produced by the blocking high-pressure system are precisely the atmospheric configuration under which grass pollen and tree pollen counts reach their seasonal peaks. Grass pollen season in England typically peaks in mid-June, but sustained warmth in late May can accelerate pollen release by 2 to 3 weeks, pushing grass pollen counts into the very high range, while the antihistamine management routines of the 13 million or more UK hay fever sufferers are still calibrated for the earlier season tree pollen profile. Certain antihistamine formulations reduce the body's sweating efficiency, an interaction that directly compromises heat management during high temperature exposure. A person managing high pollen counts with antihistamines during a 30-degree day in late May is dealing with a compound physiological challenge that neither the weather forecast nor the pollen forecast, taken separately, fully communicates. The summer of 2026 that sits behind this specific brought forward date is the final piece of context that converts a weather story into a climate story. The Met Office's seasonal outlook for May through July assigned 40% probability to a hot outcome, double the normal baseline. Preliminary forecasts for the full summer suggested temperatures running up to 1.5 degrees Celsius above the 1991 to 2020 seasonal average, with multiple heatwave events considered likely rather than possible. If May 28th delivers the 30-degree reading that the models are projecting, it does not mark the end of the heat story for 2026. It marks the beginning of it. The date was brought forward. The summer behind the date was not canceled. The June, July, and August that follow will still carry the elevated probability of sustained warm periods, multiple heat wave declarations, and temperatures that continue pushing against and potentially past the records set in 2022. Britain in 2026 is not experiencing an unusual spring followed by a normal summer. It is experiencing the opening chapter of a warm year in a warming climate, and the fact that the first 30-degree crossing is arriving in late May rather than late June tells you something specific and important about how much faster that climate is moving than the systems built to respond to it were designed to accommodate. The date has been brought forward. Everything else is still coming.